Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. I am Kevin Grasso, your host for this episode, and I'm excited to talk with Vincent DeCaen today about word order in Biblical Hebrew. Welcome to the show, Vince.
Welcome. Morning.
So, just a little bit about Vince before we get started. He was an undergrad of the University of Toronto with a degree in linguistics in Ukrainian and Russian. He finished at Wilfrid Laurier University in religious studies, and he has his master and PhD from the University of Toronto, combining linguistics and biblical Hebrew language and literature in the context of the ancient world. He has a professional master's in information studies, and he's currently self-employed independent information broker and a professional librarian at Toronto Public Library. So he has a wide range of interests, and the main thing we're going to be talking to him about today is a study that he did with Elizabeth Cowper. So Elizabeth Cowper is she? I don't know. I know she was at Toronto at one point. Is she retired now or
Emeritus? Yeah,
you're right. So
Emeritus,
she's a professor,
actively participating and active in the field still.
Yeah, so she's a professor emeritus at University of Toronto. Very well-known syntactician. She's got an introductory textbook that came out, I think, in 92, still in print. And yeah, so she worked with Vince on this paper called Biblical Hebrew, A Formal Perspective on the Left Periphery. So that's kind of what we're going to go through today, this paper, and we will post a link to that in the show notes for you to look at more carefully. It's a pretty technical paper, just to say that from the outset. If you're not familiar with syntactic terminology, we're going to try to go slowly, explain our terms, use examples, all of those things. So we're hoping it'll be understandable, but we do have to dive into some of these more theoretical issues, at least somewhat, to explain the claim of the paper. So I think that's a good place to start. So what is the central claim of your paper?
Well, I can read it. We will argue that the articulated structure of the biblical Hebrew clause is as shown in 1. And then there's a diagram. Nice linguistic tree, syntactic tree, has a hierarchy or nesting of functional heads and positions for nonverbal constituents. So that's the annoying answer. A slightly less annoying answer is that Hebrew works more or less like Old French or Old Occitan, which is not very helpful if you're not into medieval Romance dialects. And then the third is, I can read it here too. Biblical Hebrew clause structure is consistently verb medial, which is another way of saying verb second or V2, in which the verb moves from position to position. And also a null pronoun, but we can talk about that later. Which now, just in passing, the Old French is not trivial. You might say, well, why the Old French? But it's an important rhetorical flourish, because always the pushback is, well, what language possibly works like that? There's no language that works like that. Well, here's a couple of languages that work like that. Well understood, well attested, and so on. But so verb movement is pretty easy because we have it in English. So if I say to you, Kevin, biblical Hebrew word order does make a difference. Fine, nice statement. But now if I say to you, does biblical Hebrew word order make a difference? No. What did I just do? We could say that the verb is in one place here, the verb is in another place there. The relatively marked construction, the question, the verb is over here. So one way to look at it is that the verb is moved. Simple. It's moved to the front. Well, why is it moved to the front? Well, we would say that there's something there. It's real, it's present, but you can't hear it. It's phonologically null. That's the technical term. Phonologically null. So how do you realize something that you can't hear? Well, you move the verb to that position, and at that position you're realizing the feature or whatever it is, some question feature. But I can also say to you, Kevin, wow, does biblical Hebrew ever make a difference? I can still have the verb out front. Or I can get really fancy and sort of muse and say, well, does biblical Hebrew order make a difference? So it's combining question and exclamation. So in all cases, the verb moves. Simple. Now, the problem is that in the conventional analysis of biblical Hebrew, they say the verb is in first position. So you would have it backwards. You would be saying the question order is the normal word order. And to get the basic statement, you have to move some constituent in front of the verb. It doesn't make any sense, but that's the conventional analysis. So in a sense, that's the original contribution that I make is emphasizing that. No, in fact, the verb moves, and that's how it moves. Now, verb 2 is kind of simple too. We all have to learn German as our first Semitic language. I mean, you can't. Everything is in German. The basic works, the seminal works, the reference works, all in German. So I have an advantage because my mother's German, and so I didn't have to work too hard. But if I say, ich habe das Buch gelesen. I, first person pronoun, have, das Buch, the book, gelesen, read. I read the book. Ich habe das Buch gelesen. Fine. There's a constituent. There's a verb. We say it's in second position. It's V2, and then you get the rest. But I can also say, das Buch habe ich gelesen. I can put the book have I read. And we can do this all day. We could say yesterday. Gestern habe ich das Buch gelesen. So I put gestern, yesterday out front, verb in second position, and so on. So what we're saying is that biblical Hebrew works like that. If there's a position out front, call it topic, call it Kevin, call it whatever you want. I actually like calling it Kevin. Let's call it Kevin. Put it out front, verb follows. So that's really counterintuitive because everybody assumes that Hebrew word order has the verb out front. So how does that even work? That's the interesting part of the analysis. So
right. So then what you would have to say, just connecting this to what we said in English already, is that when you do see the verb out front, there is something phonologically null that is triggering. That's actually first, right? And that's triggering the verb to move, and it appears that it is, in first position, but in reality, there's something there that's, marking this as, special in some way. So, we can say pragmatically marked. I mean, I think that's a little bit, it might not necessarily be pragmatically marked, right? In the sense that, in theory, there could be other reasons why, something could move other than pragmatics. But there would have to be some sort of reason, why the verb would be in initial position, right? Is that the basic claim?
So if you ever come across the word economy in a reference to syntax, the idea is you're lazy. You don't do anything unless you have to. So the verb stays home unless it has to fulfill some function. So what we'll always be saying is that there's something real that's structurally there. It's just you can't hear it. It's phonologically null. So you have to move a constituent. Now in Hebrew we have the word ha, the particle ha. So in fact that position is overtly marked. We don't have to move the verb to mark ha. Ha's already. But if you have a constituent that's there that's not heard, then the verb has to move to realize it. We say the verb is spelling that out. Another piece of technical jargon.
Right. And so we again, I think some people that when they hear words like phonologically null and, hidden and those kinds of terms, they say, oh, well, like this is just theory internal stuff and it's not real, right? But I think the important point here is that, like we've said, English does the exact same thing, right? So for a yes, no question, you move the verb does, right? And you put it first. And that triggers to us that this sentence is special, right? This is not a normal sentence, right? It's doing something different. And so the point would be that, this kind of movement is very, very normal across languages. And it just, what it means is that those kinds of clauses, right, wouldn't necessarily be a good example of a basic clause, right? So I think that's kind of the point, and I think that's an important thing to define here. So what is your definition of basic word order? Because some people within biblical Hebrew too, they look at narrative and they say, oh, we see VSO order all the time. Narrative is pretty basic, so that's the basic order, right? So what is your definition of basic word order?
Well, it's not frequency, that's for sure. But in fact, we say that word order has no meaning within the theory at all. It has no technical meaning. It has no function in the theory. But we notice in passing, this is footnote 4. Let's see if I can find it here. It's, we're quoting Szewierska, 1988, who says, within the context of typological studies, that's the important thing. Basic word order is within another theory, another context, typological studies. Basic word order is typically identified with the order that occurs in stylistically neutral, independent, indicative clauses with a full noun phrase, subject noun phrase. All the participants are there. Subject is definite, agentive, and human. The object is a definite semantic patient, and the verb represents an action, not a state, not an event. So if you can find a clause that satisfies that definition, then in this typological framework, we'd be saying that's basic word order. Now, it just happens to be the first sentence in the Bible is basic word order. So we're lucky. We don't have to look very hard. So in Genesis, you have an overt subject, it's definite. You have an overt object, it's definite. You have a finite verb, it's not a state, it's an event, and so on down the line. It's a statement, it's not a question. So if you look at that definition under note 4, you'll see that in the beginning is in fact basic word order.
Well, and I think that would be a great, one to come back to just as an example, because I mean, one of the things that makes that example so good is also introducing the discourse, right? And so you wouldn't expect to see any sort of like funny pragmatic stuff going on, right? Because there are no participants at this point in the story. So
exactly. So we could add that to the definition.
Right. So that's great. So I think, before we kind of jump into the weeds here, and we can, start out, like I said, with this Genesis 1:1 example, but can you define for us what the left periphery is? So this is the title of your paper, right? A formal perspective on the left periphery. So can you just tell us, again, thinking of people that don't necessarily know this kind of terminology, what does that mean and why is it significant for word order in Hebrew?
Well, at the most general level, periphery is an edge. So the beginning of the sentence, the left edge, the left periphery, the left extreme, and then we can also talk about a right periphery. In fact, we don't talk about the right periphery, but there's a whole nother study there. It's not trivial. It's very complex, very interesting. But to bring it to the German example, that's very useful. German grammarians that study German, they divide the sentence into 3 parts. There's an initial part they call the Vorfeld, the pre-field, the beginning field, the Mitfeld, the middle field, and then the Nachfeld, the after field. So, I mean, if you're into baseball, you got left field, center field, right field. But the idea is it's tripartite, it's a really good place to start. So for the German students of German linguistics, the Mitfeld begins with the finite verb. Everything pivots on the finite verb. So everything in front of the finite verb is the Vorfeld, the pre-field, the left field. So when we're talking about Hebrew word order, we're also talking about that range and we'll call it the left periphery. Now, it happens that in the theoretical work, where the sentence is tripartite, you have a CP, IP, and VP, fancy words for beginning, middle, and end. So in the really technical jargon, we're talking about an articulated CP, whatever. But so before the verb, that's the left periphery. How are we doing?
Yeah.
And so the CP would be, the complement phrase, right?
Complementizer phrase, yeah.
Right. So where you would see things as an example of a complementizer would be like key, for example, at times.
Yeah,
right.
Perfect example.
And so the idea is that, and we see this in the syntax, right? Like that those kinds of words come first, right? They're on the left part of the, in Hebrew it's actually the right part because we read right to left. But when we talk in syntax, it's always left to right in syntax. So by the left part we mean the beginning, right? And so the idea is that when we have a word like key, we put it in the beginning, right? And so it's occupying some place that's higher or to the left of the verb and also the, like, what's called the TP or IP, the inflectional phrase or tense phrase. So just the idea is that it's doing something, it's having some sort of function that's really outside of the normal, outside of the verb, really.
Yeah.
The verb in its tense. Is that fair?
Right. Yeah, more or less, yeah.
And so there's all kinds of things that and this is the point of one of the points of your paper is this articulated structure. So there's all kinds of things that you have, to the left of TP, all kinds of basically reasons why you might have different orders. So I'm just looking at this tree on page 2. You have a topic phrase, an existential phrase, sigma phrase.
Topic is pivotal. The topic phrase is where the action is. Right.
And so let's go ahead and talk about that. And this is your first section in the paper. Part of the problem I have with using the word topic, and it's okay to use the word topic, but especially within biblical Hebrew studies is how it's defined, right? And sometimes people will define topic so broadly that it ends up being, basically the subject, right? And we actually talked about this, Paul Krager and I, in the introductory episode. If you define topic in a way that it's broad enough, you can make anything the topic. And the problem is with that, people have said, okay, well, this subject, we see SV order here, right? Well, this subject is fronted for topic, right? And so every time they see SV, they say, oh, it's fronted for topic. It's fronted for topic. It's fronted for topic. But if your definition of topic is close to just what it means to be a subject, right? Then you can say that, right? And it just means that it's a subject, and it might not be pragmatically marked in any way. And so all that to say, how do you define, you talk about this aboutness topic. How do you define aboutness topic, and can you give an example?
Well, we can talk about aboutness, but the important thing is we're doing syntax. So what you're talking about before was information structure, normally topic, comment, discourse, pragmatics, but I'm talking syntax. So we could just as easily call topic Fred. It doesn't matter, call it whatever. It's a position, and a constituent shows up there, and it shows up there for a reason. Now, it just happens to be that phenomenon is all across the board. So German is a good example, and that would actually be the research project. To what extent can we go through a particular biblical Hebrew corpus and compare it with what we actually see going on with a living, breathing language where we have native intuitions and so on? How does that syntax and, say, the German or Dutch syntax, how does that compare? And you would expect that would be more or less the same function. Now, if you're heavily into pragmatics or discourse analysis, well, using topic there is not what I'm talking about. So I can look at a clause and say, oh, there's Fred. There he is. And he's there because whatever. Oh, here's another clause. Well, there's the Fred there. I'd like you shouldn't get bogged down on topic. It just so happens that when you look at other languages like German, well, they call that the topic. So,
So what is this position though? Like
so
what?
aboutness is interesting. So that's not the syntax as such, but go back to the German. Ich habe das Buch gelesen. With the ich out front, that would be a reasonable answer to who read the book. Now, if I say das Buch habe ich gelesen, that would be a reasonable answer to, well, what did you read? Or if I say gestern habe ich das Buch gelesen, would be a reasonable answer to, well, when did you read the book? So there is aboutness, and you can think of it in those terms. That's one way to think of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So maybe it would be helpful at this point to give an example in Hebrew, and I think your example in your paper is Genesis 1:1. So can you explain? So in Genesis 1:1 we have Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. So we have Bereshit first, in the beginning, right? Bara, create. Elohim.
Second, yeah.
Right? Yeah, right. So the verb comes second after Bereshit, in the beginning.
Syntactic topic.
Right. So how, and then we have the subject following the verb, bara Elohim. And
which is where the subject is predicted to be if it's not the topic.
Right. And then we have the object.
The rest.
Right? It's definite. Right. The rest. And so tell me in this example, what is your analysis? So you say that you said Bereshit is the topic. What does that mean? Why is it a topic? And what makes it the topic here?
Well, it just happens to be in a particular slot. It's a syntactic position. Like I said, we could call it Kevin. We don't have to call it topic. And the verb is there because it's marking a feature. Topic feature happens to be. And in terms of syntax, it doesn't matter terribly which one is there. We could just as easily have Elohim bara, or we could have Et hashamayim bara Elohim. It's some constituent, verb second, overt subjective there, the rest. End of story. Now, if you want to get into the weeds on information structure, by all means, get into it, but that's not my interest.
So then this is what you say. You say that the topic, Bereshit bearing the syntactic feature topic, moves to spec CP to check a strong topic feature on C. So we talked about this.
That's just what I said.
Right. So, well, just connecting it to this idea of CP, right? We talked about this CP earlier. And so this sort of position to the left of the verb, in theory, we could put all kinds of things there.
Non-verbal constituent, yeah.
Right. So so the idea is that to the left of the verb, we have this place where we could also see, like we said before, a key or other sorts of elements there. In Genesis 1:1, we see Bereshit, and so your analysis. So I think this is an important point here, that if some people might look at this and say, oh, this is evidence that biblical Hebrew is verb subject order, right? Because the subject comes after the verb, right? So how do you what would you say to someone that said, look, this is verb subject order, this is evidence of my position, and you're saying, no, this is actually evidence of your position. So how do you distinguish between those two?
Well, the word order goes back to the does example. I mean, it's pretty straightforward, right? The verb initial is the marked one. It's the extra semantics. It's the extra syntax. And the verb second, in English, would happen to have subject, does, and so on, is the unmarked, syntactically, semantically, pragmatically. So what we could do is talk about the Nikachi's. Nikachi has this idea that the Yitto form, actually you can have a different position with a different meaning, no doubt. So if I said David yichtov et hasefer, fine. But I could also say et hasefer yichtov David. So I'm topicalizing. I can do that. I think you can do that in modern Hebrew. What you can't do in modern Hebrew is what you do in biblical Hebrew. You can also say yichtov David et hasefer. Now, whatever the other one means, the one with the verb in front, don't mean that. That's the neglected point. I just realized Nikachi's neglected point of syntax. So what happens with the yichtov out front? Well, in many respects, it's like the does out front. It moves, and it's moving to mark something that you can't hear. It's a feature. It's syntactically there. The verb makes it, it's realized. It's spelled out. So what are you spelling out? Well, whatever the jussive is in Hebrew, whatever feature you understand that to be, that's what the verb is supposed to be marking. So just from that basic point, everything else has to follow. It follows that verb movement is marked. That would be VSO is not the basic at some level. And the verb second is just the basic statement. But what happens then when you've got the narrative forms? Well, that's another story. But
so yeah, and so we can get to that. So let's
what you end up saying in the conventional analysis is that the jussive form with the verb initial is somehow basic, which makes no sense at all. And that to get the simple statement, you have to move a nonverbal constituent out front.
Right. So
I'll actually say that. If you want me to go look it up, there's one or two that have said that. I mean, if that makes sense to you, fine. Don't make any sense to me.
So let's just look at this again here, just so we're really clear. So the idea is that the jussive, actually in modern Hebrew, you would say she.
Yeah, you can't say, that's right.
So you say she.
Although I've consulted a number of modern Hebrew speakers, they say, well, I get a funny something. I just don't know what it is, which is an interesting reaction.
Yeah. I mean, some of them. I mean, a lot of it depends on their age too. You know,
no, exactly. If you go to the grammars from the 1960s, you'll find that construction with the analysis I've just given. But
you won't hear that.
Most people are
from
now dead
5-year-olds.
Would have spoken that version. So
yeah. It's modern Hebrew is a really interesting animal. So in biblical Hebrew, we have what you're saying is that the jussive is has a meaning that is marked. It's not normal, right? And so I think people can kind of accept this premise, right? That the jussive is not your typical statement, right? It's expressing a wish. I mean, there's all kinds of things we could call it semantically. I would call it basically an optative verbal mood. But again, it's kind of beside the point.
That's the important thing. It's mood.
Right. So it is reflecting something semantic, a different mood, right? Again, call it what you want. And really give a meaning what you want but the issue is that it's not indicative, right? Is your point. It's not just like your normal plain. It doesn't fit the definition of basic that we talked about earlier, right?
Yeah, and in fact, in many verb forms, there is a separate jussive form.
Right.
So not only would you get the verb moving, but you would actually get it spelled out in a slightly different form, which I think confirms the analysis. I don't see any way around that.
Right. So in the morphology, we see it as well, right? So then the idea is that if jussive is verb initial, and that means that in theory, if someone said that basic order is verb subject, then they would have to say that the jussive order is the basic order.
Exactly.
Right. And so the idea, I think what they would have to say, right, is, to make sense, is they would have to say, well, the verb, it really starts out verb subject, and the verb moves higher, for example, right? And so, you'd still see verb subject, but you would have another movement that you're not seeing. But then what the problem with that, right? And I think this would be, and correct me if I'm wrong here, your pushback would be that the yiktol used without the jussive form, right? Kind of the normal order with yiktol is subject verb, right? And so that would be the issue, right? Is when you have this, indicative, so normal clause, you have the opposite order. So it looks as if, the verb in the jussive really is just moving in front of the subject. Is that the idea
in front
here?
of the topic, in front of the topic.
Right, in front of the
Which
topic.
may or may not be an overt subject.
Right. So we might have, verb. So your analysis would be we'd have verb, topic, whatever, in the jussive.
Right. And okay. you do find that the subject is displaced one over. There's some other constituent there. So the verb movement in the topic is somewhat orthogonal, right? You can have one or the other going on at the same time. So adds to the fun.
So does this mean then every time you see V1 in Biblical Hebrew, the verb has moved?
Well, technically the verb's always moving, right? It moves out of the VP, if you want to get technical. So there's two movements. The one is into the midfield, where the finite verb normally appears, and then the verb can subsequently move into the left periphery, the CP. So there are a couple reasons why the verb might move. The one is there's some feature there that's phonologically null, has to be spelled out. So if you don't spell it out, the sentence is no good. You have to move the verb. Another way the verb might move is with the WH words, what we call WH words, because in English you say what, when, where, and so on. Well, and then the verb goes along with that for a ride. That's fine. But the other thing, and this is the one that's so counterintuitive to a lot of speakers who don't have prodrop in their, right? There's two types of language. So prodrop means that you can have a pronoun that's not pronounced. It's phonologically no, but it's there syntactically. So it's possible to have a null pronoun in topic position. You sort of have to get your head around that. So there's something there, but you can't hear it. And the actual word order appears verb first, right? In terms of just a linear order.
But there's no overt subject.
So we would say that it's still verb second.
Right.
And what we called it in the paper, I think is reasonable, is a pseudo verb first. It's not really, that's opposed to the verb actually moving, right? So you could get V1 for two reasons. One is the verb has moved past topic way out into the left periphery. And the other is that you have a null pronoun that's there, but you can't hear it. So what that predicts is that the verb ones, those structures will always have a null pronoun. Right? If there's an overt subject, overt pronoun, then you would see the verb moving, right? So it's a little tricky. I don't know. Does that?
Yeah.
In English, you have to have a pronoun. In French, you have to have a pronoun. In Russian, you have to have a pronoun. But other languages, including modern Hebrew, you can get away without the pronoun. We would say that's prodrop. And in fact, Rob Homestead has the encyclopedia entry on prodrop. You can look at that.
So then that case, and I think I think for most people, they would be really concerned with the relationship between the subject and the verb. And so in some ways, those clauses don't really count, right? Because we don't have an overt subject, right? And so they wouldn't be evidence. The point would be, even if we see them as V1, right? They're not evidence of a VS basic order, because we don't know, if it's a null subject, we don't know if the subject really is going before or after, right? Just from looking at a single clause like that, right? It could be either, in theory. Is that the point?
Yeah. So there's two ways around that. The one is if the verb form actually shows the difference, which is often the case. And the other way you can see that is when you have an overt complementizer. So take a share, ki, ha. You see it. That is the complementizer. And then it's followed immediately by the verb. Well, how can that happen? Well, it's predicted that in those cases there's no overt subject in that clause. And that's 99.9% of the time. That's in fact what you find. So that all nets out very nicely, right? There's other ways to show that.
Yeah. So that's helpful. So then so we have those sorts of pro-drop examples. Now you said there's another, way we get V1, and we've talked about the jussive in relation to this, right? Some sort of feature. Can we just like take a parenthesis really quick and can you define for us like what a feature is if someone hasn't heard that term? Like what does that mean for
Yeah, that
feature
gets really technical. There are whole books on what's a feature. I just
Right. And so I think the point with the feature is that again, this would be this would disqualify it as a basic clause, right? Because there is something that's affecting the movement. So or the verb to move, right? So something in the semantics.
In all cases.
Right. So then we have we talked about one feature that might do this, right, is mood, right? So in the jussive we have some sort of mood that's triggering this V1 order. You also talk about something called narrative inversion, and I think this is really a huge thing within biblical Hebrew studies, right? Because like we said earlier, people will go to Genesis, they'll start out and they'll say, look, V1, 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 right? Vayiktol, 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 Vayiktol. And they walk away feeling like, at least from a frequency perspective, right? They say, oh, like V1 is everywhere, right? And so they have in their head this idea that that is unmarked, right? And so how your analysis is that, and you can clarify here if I'm saying it right or not, but is that the verb actually is inverted there. There's a reason why it's there, and it's not. That doesn't mean it's basic, and you call that narrative inversion. So can you just explain for us like how this happens and why this happens in biblical Hebrew?
Well, I mean, we could start with the frequency. That should be a no-brainer. So in every language, like Hebrew is not isolated. This is the funny thing. You can find these narrative tenses all over the world. Every language family. Tibetan, ancient Egyptian, Swahili, Zulu, Fula. I mean, you can just go around the globe. And what you always get is a high frequency for these narrative forms. They're marked syntactically, morphology, you'd say semantically. I assume there's something, some feature like then. So, and then, and then, and then. So if I say, I went to the store and I bought some milk and I came home, it's only I went to the store that's going to have what you would otherwise think is the normal morphology, normal syntax, normal semantics, and then the and then, and then, and then. So do the math. You're going to have what, a ratio of 20% to 1? On average, 25% narrative versus the initial 1. So the frequency falls out. Just it has to be more frequent, and that's what you find. So if you study Swahili just for fun, it's an easy one to learn. That's what you'll get. You'll get a high proportion in narrative. Now, in direct speech, that's a whole other story. In poetry, that's going to be another whole story. Um, it's the narrative. Um, so in Hebrew, there there's no way around that you have a verb first, but we've already established that that's marked. And in fact, you can look at the verb forms. You also get the short form, not the long form. We've seen the short form before. That's when the verb moves. Interesting coincidence, right? So in fact, that sort of throws the entire analysis overboard, because what is generally thought is that the narrative forms are old tenses. They're fossils. They're fragments. Somehow they've carried forward. But in fact, cross linguistically, we know it's mood. It's always mood. It's called modal coordination. All of these languages have two. There's a coordination for simple unmarked, and then there's a coordination for modal. It's always two. Well, it just happens Hebrew has two. Coincidence.
Right. And
But one thing it does predict is that since the verb has moved, you could have the topic immediately behind the verb, followed by the overt subject. That would be a predicted possibility. Because they're orthogonal. Orthogonal. The verb moves or not, the topic is there or not. You can have both.
So then the idea in that case would be that if you have a topic, so let's say you have a topic and then the verb and the topic, right? But if the topic is not the subject, right? And you have a narrative verb form, then the order you're going to see is verb, topic, non-subject, subject. Is that right?
Right.
Right. So what this predicts is that sometimes, you would have things like VOS order, right? And the analysis there would be, verb, narrative verb, right? So there's some sort of narrative feature, right, that's making that move. And then topic, let's say object, for example, could be and then subject, which the subject here has stayed in its initial position, and it's seen all of these things pass by it, right?
Exactly.
For different reasons.
Exactly. And the inversion is just a term that with the languages that do this, in the European languages, Romance, Germanic, and so on, that's just the term they use. This inversion. All they mean is that the verb is moved up front. Yeah.
Right. And again, this is something that I actually discussed with Paul Krager in an earlier episode. Just that narrative, and so he studied what was the name of his language? Oh, I can't remember now. But he was in Malaysia, and I can't remember the exact language that he worked with there. But I mean, I think this happens in Malay and the language that he was working with. But he said that everything in narrative is passive, so it's all passivized. And the subject is gone, right? So and his point was, just your point as well, that this is very common cross-linguistically to see different verb forms in narrative, and what you really have to look at is direct speech. If we're a more prototypical clause structure, because funny things happen when we talk for whatever reason in narratives or sequences. So it just, again, I think the caution here is not that those valuable forms are irrelevant, but what is the analysis that makes the most sense cross-linguistically and syntactically? And we can't. Right. And we certainly can't just say,
I'll just keep saying Nakachi, Nakachi, Nakachi.
Right.
Every time you ask me something, I'll say Nakachi.
So that's narrative inversion. So we talked about some different reasons for, V1 order, narrative inversion, jussive. You also talk about something called a hanging topic, and the reason why I want to discuss this here, I mean, first of all, it's commonly talked about within biblical Hebrew grammars. Casus pendus is the the biblical Hebrew grammar term. But you, I want to talk about it because you also call it a topic, right? A hanging topic, right? And so this is just distinct
so
from
it's
your
the terminology again,
right.
Wouldn't it be great if we had Kevins and Susans? Forget about topic, hanging topic.
Well, but I think part of the problem here is, it is the terminology, right? It's that people are using similar terms in different ways, right? And so just want, to be clear on this.
Yeah. So syntax.
Right.
Syntax.
So you have these two places in the syntax that you're calling one hanging topic, one about this topic. What's special about the hanging topic position, or can you give an example in biblical Hebrew of the kind of thing we're talking about with that?
Well, if you look at Gross, actually, I have this one of my favorite, most prized possessions. You can see that Dependence Construction in biblischen Hebräisch. It's amazing. So the guy's gone through basically every clause in the Bible looking for hanging topics, and he's classified every single construction. And there are a number of diagnostics that will give it away. Everybody talks about a resumptive pronoun, which is fine. I don't know Rob, but Kevin, I know him, right? What is the him doing? I'm talking about Kevin. Well, somehow Kevin is outside, and him is inside, and the two are related. But you don't have to. And in fact, in Hebrew, you can have a null pronoun, which is just, if you keep adding the null pronoun, you get a little dizzy because of all of the different permutations, combinations. But the complementizers, in theory, mark the left edge of the sentence. So if you've got a constituent that's left of the complementizer, then there's no way it's in the sentence, right? So that's kind of a theoretical, theory internal kind of idea. And the other way is having two constituents in front of the verb, right? Because that doesn't follow from anything we've said about the basic syntax. So it's predicted that the one immediately in front of the verb is syntactic topic, and the one in front of that is the hanging topic, right? So you can run through a list of diagnostics, and you end up with a whole bunch of examples of the hanging topic. So that's how it works syntactically. Now, you were asking about discourse, pragmatics, because
no, just want to get our terminology straight here. Between, so if someone reads your paper and they come and they see, okay, your initial tree on page 2, you have 2 topics, right? In the tree, and so, but they're doing different things, and I think that's the important point here, is that, and I know you're not concerned about the terminology. The reason why I'm concerned about the terminology, specifically the use of the word topic, is this issue of people defining it in different ways, and then for you guys, right? You go through and you do define these different terms, and it doesn't matter what we call them. It does matter for us understanding your position, that the hanging topic, what you're saying is it's outside of the clause, right? And so it's doing.
You can have a hanging topic at the right edge too. Some of the scholars in the field right now are looking at that, which a little trickier, but that makes sense.
So then it's doing something fundamentally
for Hebraeus,
different.
let's just take hanging topic out. Just forget hanging topic. Let's just call it pendants.
Right.
So you have topic, you have pendants. So never the two shall meet, right?
Right. And so that's the point here, is that you have two different positions, right? And this is what you guys are wanting to say, is that what's important is that we have these different positions that have different functions, and one of them is outside of the clause, and one of them is inside, right? And so again, call it what you may. So let's just go back to these different kinds of things that affect order now. So the other two big ones, and we've touched on this a little bit, I just want to get your final thoughts on this, and before we start wrapping up. Questions and subordinate clauses. How are these unique, and how do they affect word order in Biblical Hebrew? So we saw this in English. And we've mentioned WH questions. So what about these WH words in Hebrew, like ma, me, right? How do they affect word order? And how does that relate to the basic word order? So we'll start with that.
Well, the idea is that the WH words are moving to a position higher. In this case, if you want to get technical, is a spec CP. There's a position there. And the finite verb has to go with it. So in terms of linear order, you'll see question word, finite verb, topic if it's not the question word, overt subject if it's not the topic. You can see why this gets to be fun, right? But in subordinate clauses, that so what we say is that Hebrew is a V2. It's symmetrical, which means that V2 obtains in the main clause, V2 obtains in the subordinate clause. That's not like German. German V2 in the main clause, verb final in the subordinate clause. So that's called an asymmetrical V2. It just happens that Yiddish is a symmetrical V2. Keep coming back to Yiddish. I've discovered Yiddish. I'm really getting... Ironically, Biblical Hebrew is more or less like Yiddish, except Yiddish doesn't drop pronouns. So if we could get Yiddish to drop pronouns, I mean, they even have infinitives absolute. How weird is that?
Oh, that is weird, actually.
How likely is that? Oh, well. All right. So where are we going with that?
So then the idea is that with WH questions like me or ma, what we would expect is this initial WH word, right, and then the verb.
The verb, yeah. So the verb is moved. It has to mark that constituent is in the spec CP.
And then
so the verb moves in the same way the verb moves for the topic, right? It goes along for the ride. Topic comes, the verb goes along with it. So WH word moves, the verb goes along with it. But in terms of linear order, then it's going to be a little more subtle, right? Because topic and WH are two different positions.
Right. And so then the point here would be, again, in WH questions, we would have WH word, verb, and then topic if it's not the subject, right? Or subject if it is the topic, right? And then anything else, right? So in theory, we could have something like WH word, verb, subject, right? Or WH word, verb, object, or PP, subject, right? And so again here, what we're saying is that we have VS order if you look at it on the surface, right? If you're just looking at the relationship between verb and subject, we have VS order. But your analysis is not that you have VS order in Biblical Hebrew, but that the verb is second. And so we have this WH word that's actually first, right? And then we have the verb, right? And then everything after that is irrelevant in terms of what we're determining as the basic order, right? Is that basically your position?
But okay, the fun thing is that what comes afterwards is almost as interesting, right?
Right.
And there are some. I noticed a work that was doing roughly what Grasso was doing for the postverbal order, where it's just all cataloged, laid out, and I want to get back to that sometime. But it's not trivial how the ordering is in the Nachfeld.
Right. So let me ask you this, and this actually isn't in my notes. So those, I think, as far as the those who are, let's say, against VS order, would know you and Rob as kind of the two, like Robert Homestead is as kind of the two big proponents of VS not being the basic order, right? And so
he has a slightly different version.
Right. So that was what I was going to ask you.
Some of the fun will be down the road is comparing and contrasting different versions within the grammatical theory, and then looking at some of the other stuff like SIF people who are working in different theories, different contexts.
Right. So he says, Biblical Hebrew is SV, XV, X being any sort of constituent. So I think your position, correct me if I'm wrong here, would just be XV. It's just XV, and that could be the subject, right? It could be anything. Is that a fair analysis?
Right. So the difference is how you treat topic. So, for instance, Old English is a good example where it's verb second, but not necessarily. I mean, it's more pragmatic. You don't always get it there. Topic is, in some sense, optional. So the difference between the two ideas is we're saying topic is not optional. Every single clause, main clause, subordinate clause, every single clause has a topic. End of story. Which is another way you could go with this in terms of discourse application, is to go through a narrative and say, yep, every clause, there's a topic, there's a topic, there's a topic, there's a topic, all the way through, and just take a look at how that's working, right? Like you could develop a discourse theory out of that.
Right. So
whereas Rob, I think, is saying that it's optional.
Right. So Rob is saying that the subject might not be the topic, right? And so you could have a sentence with just SV, and you don't have a topic. That's the basic idea, or the basic difference, I should say.
Well, yeah. So you'd have to check in with him to see how he manages without a mandatory topic, always a topic, and how that would work. The other difference is that he has a different idea about the positions that constituents move to and why they move. So that's not a trivial difference. It's something to look into. He assumes that you can repeat topic. You can have more than one topic position. You could have a whole row of topics, unlimited in theory, right?
Yeah, so that is interesting. So for those who do want to compare, we can post some of Rob's work as well, to the notes for here. But just as a way to wrap up.
Don't quote me. You'd have to talk to him directly.
Sure.
But
and I actually
other interesting thing is that he has a focus phrase.
Right.
I'm coming to the view that he's right. There's got to be a separate focus phrase. If you really get into the weeds in word order, there's another position there. So if I were to continue with this, I would extend the theory and try to work that into it. I think he's right. So you have a topic phrase, you have a focus phrase. The question is, do you always have a focus phrase?
Right. And so that would be, that kind of leads into one of my concluding questions. Is there any data you feel like your analysis does not account for? So you would say, you would put in a focus phrase somewhere in the left periphery. So, you could have some constituent move there to be focused. And again, the definition of focus, obviously is one that's debated, but kind of the semantic definition. Man, I forget the paper now. That gave us kind of the definition, but it's the negation of alternatives. That's kind of the standard one. There was a dissertation in 92 by this guy whose last name started with an R that I cannot remember. But he, this is what he said when you say something like, Vince hit the ball, right? What you're doing is you're negating, every other alternative to Vince. And if you say Vince hit the ball, right, you're negating every other alternative to ball.
Yes. Right.
And so the idea would be that this is different than topic, and it's another reason to move. So what else? Is there anything else you feel like, if you had to go back and write this paper, you would add in or modify?
No, I think the adding the focus would be about it. But I mean, it's not reasonable to expect a theory to cover every piece of data. Like, there's no perfect theory, and I wouldn't expect the theory is as good as what you're trying to understand, and a theory captures it. But for me, the dialect is mostly Samuel King's that I'm interested in. So it doesn't follow that Esther or Ecclesiastes is even going to be within the ballpark. It might be a good starting place to analyze Esther, but it's not. So I would, and the other thing is, even within a text, you've got editorial stuff. You got mixed text. I mean, you're cutting and pasting, and then you got the editorial hand, and then the second editorial hand, and the third editorial hand, and you could even have mistakes, right? So you're looking at a theory. You say, well, here's an example that doesn't work. Well, maybe the guy was having a slow morning, he didn't have his coffee, and he made a mistake. So, but so what I'm saying is that the data is so noisy in biblical Hebrew, like worse than the kind of noise that you would have in another corpus, right? And so it's not reasonable that the theory would cover that.
Yeah, and that's an important point here. Is I think in some ways, serious linguistic analyses and things like textual criticism and form criticism kind of stand in tension, because we do want to give an analysis of the data that we have, but we also can't ignore those other fields, right? And just say that they don't exist. Particularly, I mean, we just know, for example, that there are differences in some manuscripts, so we do have to do something, right, with that kind of thing. And so, but at the same time, we do, and I think this is what your paper demonstrates, and why I found it to be very helpful. It's just that there are analyses that we can give to certain constructions in biblical Hebrew that might otherwise look very odd, right? But if we find an example like Old French, right, where it's parallel in so many ways, right, we can say, okay, maybe we don't have to chalk this up to, scribal error every time, right? But maybe this is just how biblical Hebrew works, right? And I think that's what you and Elizabeth try to do, right, is say, okay, given the data that we have, even if it looks strange to some people, there's actually lots of, theoretical tools we can use to account for that data.
And the worst problem, in a lot of ways, with biblical Hebrew is so many forms and constructions are rare. Like you only see them one in a. So one construction Elizabeth's interested in is the piano was carrying up the stairs, where we would say the piano is being carried up the stairs. So for most of English, you wouldn't realize that that's the correct form. But so I was looking at the Jane Austen novels. I would say 1 or 2 times per novel, you would see that construction. So, less than a dozen in the entire major 6 novels. So, but it's not trivial because that form ramifies through the grammar, right? To account for that form, well, this must be true, this must be true. Subtle difference here, subtle difference there. I predict this, I predict that. So it's perfectly possible that we're not handling the really rare stuff, and then it turns out the rare example is diagnostic. So,
well, I think that's a great example too of saying, okay, here's a rare form. If someone were to be looking at Old English 500 years from now, and they were to see these, examples, they might think, oh, this is a scribal error. she just messed up, right? Right, exactly. But in reality, is an important part of the grammar that we need to account for. And those kinds of things, could be scribal error, right? But I think our first, task has to be as linguists to say, okay, what might this tell us, about the system, right? And try to account for the data seriously, because I think those are the places that do challenge us, the rare forms, and they actually help to make our analysis better.
Well, that's why you need a formal theory. It forces you to look at the data. You can't run away from the data. It's explicit. So at some point you have to say, yeah, that doesn't work. Or here's an example. You can't do that without a formal theory.
Yeah, which is great because a lot of people view formalists as people who are not in the data, right? But good formal syntacticians and semanticists, have to be they're in the data all the time, and they're trying. That's exactly what they're trying to do. So do you have anything else on word order studies in Biblical Hebrew? What you're doing, or what's sort of we've mentioned several things, but what's sort of left in the field as kind of the big things that we need to be focusing on at this point?
Well, I could put it in terms of my own studies. The agenda, top of the agenda is the infinitive absolute, which is so fascinating. Were you there at the conference when we talked about the infinitive absolute?
Yeah, the one in
many
Jerusalem.
different constructions. How are they possibly related? And that gets back to the rare forms problem too. But the really stunning problem is that the infinitive absolute doesn't always match the verbal stem. It sometimes matches the binyan, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it matches part of the binyan, if that makes any sense. Sometimes it doesn't. If you have a nifal, you have two different stems. Sometimes you get an infinitive with the one stem, you get the infinitive. It's crazy. So we're trying to figure out how that can possibly work. But
yeah, well, that's exciting stuff. So we will be looking out for more from you guys on it, because I think you guys already have something on it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, in the I think.
Yeah, and then so the big item on the agenda is the cross-linguistic study of the narrative forms. Right. So we've got a pretty big database for all of these different languages, and we just have to slap it together to. There's maybe three or four different types where it suggests the different diachronic pathways, so that it may have some bearing on the history of the Hebrew narrative forms too.
Yeah, for sure. So this is actually the book. I think
there you go.
Where you're.
There's actually two papers in there.
Yeah.
The other one's
right. Your love for phonology. So, this is Linguistic Studies on Biblical Hebrew. This is actually from a conference that we did together. Some papers that were published from it in Jerusalem several years ago. So there's Elizabeth's and Vince's paper in there on the infinitive absolute. You also have the infinitive in Biblical Hebrew by Edith Duron, and all kinds of other great articles in here. So anyway, that's probably enough.
It's not a coincidence that there's so many papers on the infinitive absolute. Because once you get into a formal approach, then it's like, what is this?
Right. Yeah, for sure. I haven't even. I mean, I looked at. I remember hearing your paper and Annie Dietz and thinking, I'll just tackle this in another time. So, great. So this has been a lot of fun. And so that's all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages Podcast. Thank you, Vince, for joining us.
Okay, thank you.
And thank you to all of our listeners out there who have taken the time to listen to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.